All right, here we go with section 4. And this is the focus question. In the 1970s, post war economic expansion and consumer prosperity ended, followed by slow growth and high inflation. The end of capitalism's golden age was caused by many factors. With a booming economy driven in part by a military industrial complex, administrations had not realized how the Cold War might have less positive economic consequences. To check the Soviets, the United States had promoted the economic reconstruction of Germany and Japan and supported new manufacturing in places like South Korea and Taiwan. It encouraged American companies to invest overseas and didn't complain when allies protected their own industries while seeking unrestricted access to U.S. markets. Steel imports, for example, devastated the American steel industry, and the strong dollar, tied to gold by the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement, made it harder to sell goods overseas. In 1971, for the first time in the 20th century, the United States had a trade deficit, meaning that it imported more goods than it exported. By 1980, almost all goods produced in the United States were competing with foreign made products, and the number of manufacturing workers had declined to 28%. It had been 38% in 1960. The Vietnam War produced higher federal deficits and rising inflation. In 1971, Nixon announced a radical departure in economic policy. He took the United States off the gold standard, ending the Bretton Woods Agreement that fixed the value of the dollar and currencies in gold. From now on, world currencies floated in relation to one another, their worth determined not by treaty, but by international currency markets. Nixon hoped this would promote U.S. exports, but the end of fixed currency rates destabilized the world economy. Nixon also froze wages and prices for 90 days to stabilize the economy. These policies briefly stopped inflation and reduced imports, but a war between Israel and its neighbors Egypt and Syria led Middle Eastern governments to hike the price of oil and suspend oil exports to the United States for several months. During the oil embargo, long lines of cars appeared at American gas stations, which either ran out of fuel or limited how much a customer could buy. By this point, the United States imported one-third of its oil. Congress lowered the speed limit and urged conservation to save fuel. The energy crisis focused public attention on domestic energy sources like oil, coal, and natural gas. Oil exploration increased in the American West, and in Alaska, pipelines opened to facilitate shipment to the rest of the country. Coal production in Wyoming boomed, and the high oil prices set by the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, benefited Western energy companies. But rising oil prices affected the global economy and contributed to the combination of stagnant economic growth and high inflation known as stagflation. Between 1973 and 1981, the inflation rate in developed nations was 10% per year, while economic growth was 2.4% per year, a sharp deterioration from the 1960s. The so-called misery index, the sum of unemployment and inflation rates, stood at 10.8 in 1970. By 1980, it was near 22. With higher oil prices, Americans bought more fuel-efficient foreign cars, hurting the domestic auto industry. The economic crisis helped erode the post-war social compact. Facing lower profits and more global competition, corporations eliminated more high-paying manufacturing jobs through automation and moving jobs overseas. Older industrial cities and areas like Detroit and Chicago were devastated, while smaller industrial cities suffered even more. And as their tax bases disappeared, so did public services. Deindustrialization left a landscape of abandoned buildings, and in places, the poverty rate reached 20%. The higher flows of population, jobs, and investment to the non-union, low-wage Sunbelt states increased the political influence of this conservative region. In some manufacturing centers, political and economic leaders welcomed the change. In New York, the construction of the World Trade Center, finished in 1977, symbolized the shifted economy. To make way for the Twin Towers, the city displaced hundreds of small businesses, causing the loss of thousands of manufacturing jobs. Increasingly, jobs, investment, and population flowed to the non-union, low-wage states of the Sunbelt, a term that came into widespread use to describe the growing economic and political influence of this conservative region. Sunbelt cities pursued a different model of development and spatial growth than the older urban centers of the North and Midwest. Businesses and new housing developments sprang up along highways. Always a junior partner in the Democratic coalition, Labor found itself on the defensive in this era and has been ever since. The declining power of unions and the continuing economic shift from manufacturing to service jobs adversely affected ordinary Americans. While median family income had doubled between 1953 and 1973, real wages between 1973 and 1993 did not rise at all. The economic crisis troubled Nixon's successors. Gerald Ford, appointed to replace Vice President Agnew, assumed the presidency when Nixon resigned. Ford named Nelson Rockefeller of New York as his vice president. For the first time in U.S. history, both offices were occupied by persons for whom no one had voted. One of Ford's first acts was to pardon Nixon, which prevented his prosecution for obstruction of justice. This was a deeply unpopular decision. Ford had no significant accomplishments in domestic policy. Ford and his economic advisor, Alan Greenspan, wanted Americans to spend less and save more to build money for investment, and they called for tax cuts and less government economic regulation. The Democratic majority in Congress did not approve. To fight inflation, Ford urged Americans to shop wisely, reduce spending, and wear win buttons for whip inflation now. Though inflation fell, unemployment rose in 1975 to the highest level since the Depression. But Ford continued Nixon's policy of détente, and the United States signed an agreement with the Soviets at Helsinki, Finland, that recognized the permanence of the division of Europe. The Helsinki Accords inspired movements for more freedom in Eastern Europe's communist countries. In the presidential election of 1976, Jimmy Carter, a former governor of Georgia, narrowly defeated Ford. Carter was virtually unknown outside his state when he launched his campaign for the Democratic nomination. But realizing that Watergate and Vietnam had produced a crisis of confidence in the federal government, he turned his obscurity into an advantage. Carter ran for president as an outsider, making a virtue of the fact that he had never held federal office. Carter had much in common with progressives of the early 20th century. His passions were making government more efficient, protecting the environment, and raising the moral tone of politics. Unlike the progressives, however, he embraced the aspirations of Black Americans and appointed an unprecedented number of blacks to important positions. The Democratic Party found itself ill-equipped to deal with the economic crisis. Although his party controlled both houses, Carter often found himself at odds with Congress. He viewed inflation, not unemployment, as the country's main economic problem, and to combat it, he promoted cuts in spending on domestic programs. In the hope that increased competition would reduce prices, his administration enacted deregulation in the airline and trucking industries. Carter cut taxes for wealthy Americans and repealed usury laws. Inflation did not decline. Carter also believed that expanded use of nuclear energy could help reduce dependence on imported oil. But in 1979, the industry suffered a near-fatal blow when an accident at the 3 Mile Island plant in Pennsylvania released a large amount of radioactive steam into the atmosphere. The 3 Mile Island mishap reinforced fears about the environmental hazards associated with nuclear energy and put a halt to the industry's expansion. Carter seemed to be presiding over a period of national decline. Under Carter, a commitment to human rights defined U.S. foreign policy for the first time. Human rights groups in the 1970s that influenced Carter began to identify human rights violations not only by communist nations but by U.S. allies, especially Latin American dictatorships that used death squads to kill political opponents. In 1978, Carter cut off aid to the military dictatorship in Argentina, which, in the name of anti-communism, had launched a dirty war against its own citizens, kidnapping and murdering 10,000 to 30,000 persons. As Argentina was an important U.S. ally, this shocked Latin American regimes dependent on American aid. By his presidency's end, Carter had made human rights central to American policy. He believed that in the post-Vietnam era, U.S. policy should move away from Cold War assumptions and instead combat third world poverty, prevent the spread of nuclear weapons, and promote human rights. Carter also pardoned Vietnam-era draft resistors. Carter's emphasis on peaceful solutions to international problems brought some important results. In 1979, he brokered the Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel. He improved Latin American affairs by promising to transfer control of the Panama Canal in 2000. He resisted calls to intervene against a left-wing revolution fighting Somoza, Nicaragua's dictator. He also cut military aid to the right-wing government of El Salvador, which sponsored death squads. But despite criticisms from realists that his focus on human rights was damaging U.S. power in the world, Carter continued to pour billions into defense, and the United States continued to support allies with records of human rights violations, such as Guatemala, the Philippines, South Korea, and Iran. U.S. support for Iran undid Carter's policies and administration. Iran, strategically located on the Soviet Union's southern border, was a major supplier of oil and importer of U.S. military equipment. Carter's 1977 visit in support of the Shah, Iran's ruler, inspired a more militant opposition, and in 1979, a popular revolution led by the Muslim cleric Ayatollah Khomeini overthrew the Shah and declared Iran an Islamic republic. The Iranian Revolution marked a shift in opposition movements in the Middle East from socialism and Arab nationalism to religious fundamentalism. This had long-term consequences for America. When Carter allowed the deposed Shah to seek medical treatment in the United States, Khomeini's followers invaded the U.S. Embassy and seized dozens of hostages. They regained their freedom in January 1981, on the day Carter's term ended, and the hostage crisis deeply hurt Carter's popularity. The invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 by the Soviets, who sought to reinforce a friendly government fighting an Islamic rebellion, also confronted Carter with a crisis. Over time, the Soviet war in Afghanistan proved to be its own Vietnam, with high casualties and costs and mounting domestic dissatisfaction. At first, however, it seemed to indicate a decline in U.S. power. In response, President Carter announced the Carter Doctrine, declaring that the United States would use military force, if necessary, to protect its interests in the Persian Gulf. He retaliated against the Soviets with boycotts and withdrawal from nuclear arms treaties. The United States also began to give arms and money to Islamic fundamentalist rebels in Afghanistan, giving rise to the Taliban. In an unsuccessful attempt to bring down inflation, Carter abandoned the Keynesian economic policy of increased government spending and cut back on social spending and regulations, while projecting a major increase in the military budget. By 1980, the Cold War was reinvigorated, and many of the conservative policies associated with his successor, Ronald Reagan, were already in place when Carter's presidency ended. So, that's the end of Section 4. We'll be back for Section 5.